Trip.com CEO Jane Sun speaking with Steve there. Let's take a look at when it comes to risk assets here this morning. This board kind of says it all, that bounce in stocks basically was pretty short-lived. And you are seeing U.S. futures are in the red still. U.S. 10-year yields bid up by about 1 basis point at 326. Dollar yen, we punched about 136 now. That's a new 24-year low for yen. Bitcoin is above 20,000, but we're still seeing some downside pressure. And Brent and WTI lower by 2% this morning. Take a look at when it comes to China's stocks as well, that they're feeling the effects of what we're seeing externally. And you're seeing HS Tech is lower by about more than 1%. And MSCI China continue to see some downside. And we are continuing to watch what goes on here for the rest of the markets. The dollar is firmer here this morning, so that's why we're seeing commodities in a bit of a southern trajectory. And you're seeing when it comes to sovereign bonds in the short end of the curve, are bid up here in Australia, New Zealand, Japan as well. A lot of focus on dollar yen this morning and the yen pairs. Iron ore lower by 3% in Singapore. Coming out, Wealth Enhancement Group says U.S. markets are still looking to find a bottom and rallies are likely to be short-lived. This is Bloomberg.
So is there more pressure when you're trying to win a basketball championship than when you're trying to please investors? Where's the greater pressure?
Oh, I think it's definitely trying to win a championship. It's hard because like when you invest, and you know this, when you're investing, you can control a lot more things. When, on a basketball court, you can't control whether somebody's going to make a shot. You've got to get lucky.
And what's the greater pleasure, making 5 times your money on a distressed debt investment or winning the NBA championship?
They're both fabulous. I wish I could do one each year. That would be great. But I think there's a great feeling in being right on an investment, that you've done a tremendous amount of work and you've made money for your clients, which I think is great. I think winning a championship it's a very surreal feeling because there's a whole city or state that is actually behind you. We had 70,000 people at the finals, and we had them all outside. You had 17,000 in the stands, and then literally like 60,000 people outside. And when we won, just the joy that you had brought to the city was phenomenal.
Everyone you meet in Port Harcourt has stories about what they call black soot, caused by the manufacturing and consumption of these fuel products in the illegal refineries.
Oil theft, known as bunkering, and the refining of its spoils is worsening the damage from decades of fossil fuel exploitation, creating one of the world's most severe ecological disasters.
Our sacred forests, our homes have to give way to oil wells, and no one gets much benefit.
Imagine a resident of Port Harcourt who inhales this soot every second in 24 hours, 7 days a week, 30 days in the month, and for years now. We are dying slowly but surely, and our lifespan is reducing every day.
Almost 10 a.m. right here in Hong Kong and in Singapore. This is Bloomberg Markets. I'm Rashad Salamat with Yvonne Matt.
Our top stories this morning: Asian stocks struggle to build on the Wall Street rebound as ever louder recession warnings weigh on sentiment. Elon Musk is among those voicing caution, telling us in an exclusive interview that a near-term contraction is likely. Plus, the yen hits a fresh 24-year low as investors venture out of havens. The BOJ says its policy is not aimed at controlling FX rates.
Yeah, just taking a look at what's going on out there at the moment. I mean, it's turning a bit sour. We started off relatively positively, but certainly at the moment we are shedding some ground here. We've got the Hang Seng off by 0.5%. And, part of this is perhaps down to what we're seeing with the futures there in the US. US futures trading down about 0.5% for the Nasdaq and the S&P 500. Treasuries, the dollar, just perhaps edging up here as well. Fed's aggressive monetary tightening, of course, designed to tame inflation, kicking off those fears about them going too far and, of course, causing a recession, which is actually key here as well. And that, I suppose, is essentially what we're looking at right now. And, are these really, I suppose, well-founded, these fears of a recession?
Well, you have the likes of SocGen, Goldman, Morgan Stanley all chiming in, right? They're saying that at this point, you're going to have to see more pain to come because stocks have yet to really start pricing in this recession risk and not really showing the full magnitude of this slowdown. You have the likes of Thomas Harkin talking about, look, they're going to go as fast as they can, the Fed, and try to avoid not to break anything, right? If you take a look at some indicators, though, whether it's incomes, employment, real consumer spending, household employment, you're not quite seeing that sort of recession risk yet. I mean, it seems like right now it's coming, but maybe not quite.
Well, you look at these numbers, okay, and you look at these indicators, but then you say, well, why is the Michigan Consumer Confidence Index at record lows, way beyond anything seen before since 1977?
Yeah, certainly it's going to be one to watch. And you have the likes of Biden saying, look, it's not inevitable that we're going to see a recession. You hear Elon Musk yesterday kind of sort of counter that. Take a listen.
A recession is inevitable at some point. As to whether there is a recession in the near term, I think that is more likely than not. It certainly isn't. It's not a certainty, but it appears more likely than not.
But also you can see how this is playing because people are fearful, so they go for the havens. The yen used to be one; it doesn't seem to be now. I mean, we're looking at 24-year lows, fresh 24-year lows, another move about 1% to the downside. There we go. That chart probably tells it all. We've got asset managers shorting the yen the most on a record, and of course this has got a political dimension as well, with campaigning for upper house elections kicking off, with the Prime Minister Fumio Kishida fighting off criticism about this ultra-loose monetary policy. The LDP at the moment, I should say the Democrat Party here, the Constitutional Democratic Party, saying that this is Kishida inflation. Yeah,
the opposition is certainly going to use that to their advantage leading up to that July election. But then again, it's kind of like a free fall, though today we're seeing a little bit of that rally against the yen kind of slow down a bit here. Take a look at 136.18. We're still talking about those 24-year lows for dollar yen, Aussie yen, renminbi yen. That's interesting, that weaker fix from the PBOC. Perhaps they're getting a little bit more worried about this pair.
Yeah, suggesting the PBOC is probably taking yen weakness into account when they're setting all this as well. That's the argument, I suppose.
Yeah, 1993 highs, right? We saw a dollar, China versus the yen. And there's still a lot of people on the street talking about whether we're going to see more of these stock losses when you're saying top strategy that, look, more pain to come. Let's bring in our markets reporter, Annabelle Jewelers, for some of our morning calls. And it seems like most people are saying this is not the worst yet.
No, well, how about a 30% drop from where we are now? That's what we're hearing if you follow the views of SocGen strategists. So basically they're saying that in a typical recession, the S&P 500 tends to trade around the 3,200 level, which is about a 13% drop from where we are now. But if we do see a 1970s style inflation shock, and that's what SocGen is seeing here, then we could see as much as double those losses. Now, the link here is that when investors start to think that inflation is going to be sustained, then they start to look at real instead of nominal earnings per share, and SocGen says that that is going to be negative this year. Goldman Sachs is another one weighing in on this. So they're expecting that the S&P hasn't yet fully priced in for the recession risks. Morgan Stanley saying that we're going to get down to that 3,000 points level.
Yeah, Bridgewater says is Ray Dalio talking about the Federal Reserve perhaps being unable to get inflation in check and saying that reducing inflation will come at a great cost. That cost would be actually in terms of growth. Just one comment also here, Annabelle. We had him saying that essentially the stagflation is likely because the Fed itself is failing to drive the markets and the economy like a good driver.
That's exactly what he said. Yeah, it's actually quite a blunt LinkedIn post, but he can be, of course, sometimes. So basically, he's saying that people are being quite naive here, really, if they think that this Fed campaign to rein in price pressures is going to be a net positive. And the reason for that is that when you do raise rates, well, you're just basically squeezing people's purchasing power instead of what happens in an inflationary price or environment when you've got prices that are doing that instead. So the only way that he says that you can really meaningfully lift living standards here, that is by lifting productivity, and Rish, that is what he says, is not the job of the central bank. So yes, as he said, central banks should instead be driving or using their powers to drive the markets and economy like a good driver drives a car, also keeping debt assets and liabilities relatively stable.
Good stuff, Annabelle Drillers there. Let's get over to Los Angeles because we're joined by Ayaka Yoshioka, Senior Portfolio Consultant at Wealth Enhancement Group. Thank you so much for joining us, Ayako. Will you be changing the name of your company to the Wealth Preservation Group?
Not quite yet. We are a Wealth Enhancement Group, but I understand where you're coming from. It is a difficult environment. It has been a very challenging year thus far.
What do you make of this sort of rebound that we saw in the U.S.? Do you think that in a way that we have seen a bottom, or do we need to really see more of a 3,000 level for the S&P to really start to kind of factor in the slowdown that we're about to see?
Until we see some really strong inflation numbers come down, so I guess the declines start to become greater in magnitude, we think that some of the rallies that we're going to be seeing in markets are going to be relatively short-lived. We saw, earlier in the year, a bounce of about 10 to 12%. We could perhaps see something like that as we head into earnings season in July, but the trend is still overall in the downward direction, at least for the S&P 500.
So, Ayaka, what is the way that you advise people at the moment? Portfolio consultant, are you talking about, and I've been banging on about this, companies which have got and asset classes where there's good credit quality, that's going to be fundamental in a rising environment of interest rates, and then on top of that, perhaps good dividend yields on top of that, looking perhaps valuations naturally, and free cash flow?
Absolutely. For longer term investors, we definitely see some opportunities within the stock market. We're seeing valuations come down to much more reasonable levels than we've seen at least last year. Last year was very elevated on many respects, especially in the technology landscape. But we're starting to see some more reasonable valuations in general. On the fixed income side, we think that, again, we're seeing some reasonable solid yields here at 3-4% on the investment grade side of things. And so for high quality companies that have solid fundamentals, good free cash flow generation, we continue to believe that those are areas over the long term that can help clients out.
What sort of is the recession-proof sort of portfolio now, I wonder? Do you stick to kind of the banks, energy? What's your take?
Well, even banks and even energy last week got hit especially hard. So I don't know if there's necessarily a recession-proof portfolio per se, but there are always areas in the market that continue to do well. Commodities in general have done well this year. And, we continue to think that now it's really about looking forward and where can we continue to see some outperformance. I think there may still be some relative outperformance in the commodity area for longer, especially as inflation continues to remain elevated. But again, if it starts to come down, some of that money might start to rotate out of the well-performing commodities and back into stocks or bonds.
What about other places in the world as well, Ayaka? I mean, do you look at EM, do you look at China here as well? A few months ago, it looked as though it would have been uninvestable, but quite a lot of perhaps some of the overhangs have been removed or seemingly removed right now. Is it becoming an imperative slowly for value?
I think you're absolutely right. I think global diversification is always something that we stress with clients. And if you look at, some of the stocks within China, they were in sort of bear market or correction territories long before the U.S. market entered correction and bear markets. So they've had a lot more time to consolidate, and their valuations have become a lot more attractive than they used to be. And so I think there's definitely room for improvement, especially just because they've been in a bear market for a little bit longer than the U.S. counterparts have. Ayaka,
thank you very much indeed, Ayako Yoshioka, the Senior Portfolio Consultant at Wealth Enhancement Group. Just some headlines coming out of the Monetary Policy Committee there in China, talking about the economy there, that it could expand faster than expected this year. They've also been talking about baht depreciation, which is in line, they're suggesting, with regional currencies. Having a look at all that, and so far this year, the baht has fallen by about 5.8% against the dollar. But, you look at the regional ones, Filipino peso down about 6.4%. You look at the Malaysian ringgit, 5.3%. So absolutely spot on with that one, and suggesting the economy will adjust smoothly with rate normalization. Talking about rate normalization now, of course, they kept interest rates on hold. It was thought to be a unanimous decision, but it wasn't this time.
Well, it was a hawkish pause, and you're starting to see this sort of debate in the Philippines as well, when you're hearing from the incoming central bank governor saying, look, we're not going to go for anything too drastic or aggressive past August. They say there's going to be a gradual path. So Asian central banks continuing to try to at least see through these kind of supply side shocks. Thailand certainly is kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum versus the Fed right now, but certainly talks of rate normalization certainly is still important, but we're still seeing some downside here when it comes to the Thai baht this morning. The dollar moves very much more prominent here. Once again, strength coming through in the Asia session. All right, let's get to the first world news. We have Vonnie Quinn in New York. Hey, Vonnie.
Hey, Yvonne. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang has called for ensuring food security as the war in Ukraine threatens global supplies. Li visited a wheat farm in a province neighboring Beijing, stressing the importance of this year's harvest as worries linger over food security. Earlier this month, China's state stockpiling company bought newly harvested wheat for national reserves at record prices. A top Russian official is threatening to retaliate in a growing standoff with the European Union. That's after Lithuania blocked the transit of sanctioned goods to the Baltic territory of Kaliningrad. The Secretary of Russia's Security Council says his country will respond to hostile actions and warned Lithuania of serious negative impact. Torrential monsoon rains in parts of India have caused deadly floods and landslides, killing about 300 people and displacing millions. The monsoon arrived in India at the end of May and is set to last through September. It contributes to the deaths of hundreds of people in India every year. However, it is also one of the most important seasons for farmers in a country that's dependent on agriculture. Global News 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Vonnie Quinn. This is Bloomberg. Rish.
I guess, Vonnie, let's tell you what we've got coming up right here on Bloomberg Markets. And we are celebrating, of course, Pride Month. And we're going to be joined by a leading Hong Kong marriage equality activist to discuss how the city's crackdown on social activism is threatening to undo progress.
But first, ahead of Fed Chair Powell's semi-annual testimony to Congress, the Richmond Fed president urges the central bank to raise rates as fast as it can. Well, the details next. This is Bloomberg.
We started off as a financial institution, right? So we're regulated by so many authorities. That was actually an advantage for us moving in because it helped us to create lines of what is actually a family conversation versus what is actually a professional conversation in the workspace. And I think that over time, it's as simple as building a habit. The moment we walk into the door in the office, we owe it to ourselves to actually be professional. I don't take any of what I do for granted. And I always like to think of myself as the underdog. It's about doing genuine work and being passionate about what I do and walking in and giving it my best. In KSK, we have a culture that we like to innovate and learn very, very quickly. I believe that whether we fail or we succeed, there's always something to learn.
Bloomberg Generation Next, brought to you by Pictet.
In breaking news, oil prices are surging.
The world can be a noisy place.
Stock prices are set to soar.
But what if under all the noise was opportunity? Would you hear it? Would you see it? And if you did, would you take action? Join more than 3 million users in over 100 countries and be empowered with Capital.com.
In many areas, Tesla is Tesla, but Xpeng is Xpeng. We want to focus on what we think is important for our customers. Our customers like beautifully designed vehicles.
With love for our planet, Zurich Insurance, sponsors of Leaders with L'Aqua Goes Green.
This June, in honor of Pride Month and Juneteenth, Bloomberg brings you a special equality series every Thursday in June at 1 p.m. Eastern. Bloomberg Equality, celebrating inclusion this Pride Month and all year long.
This is Bloomberg Markets. Now, ahead of Fed Chair Jerome Powell's testimony before Congress, one policymaker says the Fed should be raising interest rates as fast as it can.
We are in a situation where inflation is high, it's broad-based, it's persistent, and rates are still well below normal. And so I think the spirit is you want to get back to where you want to go as fast as you can without breaking anything.
Let's bring in our chief Asia economics correspondent, Enda Curran, now. And Enda, talk about what Thomas Barkin was, the message he was trying to send. And do you think that Jay Powell is pretty much going to follow that later on today?
Well, he made the point that he wants to see interest rates going into what's called restrictive territory. So that's jargon for saying basically the point at which high rates do hurt consumers and households and the like. So he's clearly saying the rates have much further to go. At the same time, he didn't quite bite on whether he prefers 50 basis points or 75 basis points, but he did say he would follow the guidance of Chair Jerome Powell, who of course has left the option of both open and on the table. But then I think the bigger takeaway listening to his comments were this idea that he wants to move fast with rate hikes without hurting the economy or financial markets or without causing undue hurt. And of course, this idea of move fast without breaking things. And clearly that's the big debate, not just in the US, but globally right now. How can banks raise interest rates without tipping economies over the edge into a recession? So it's a big call, and he sounds confident that he can thread the needle.
Let's have a look at the Bank of Japan for a second. I mean, it would seem that the weakness of the yen is a product of a policy of benign neglect, but they are approaching a crossing of the Rubicon, some have said. Why?
Well, this is our colleagues on Simon White and M Live was running the numbers. He calculated that this week, in fact, they could pass the halfway mark in terms of owning more than half of Japan's bond market. Now, obviously, we don't quite know how that will play out, but when you have an investor owning half a market, there's going to be an impact on the securities that you're trading. Will that change anytime soon? We had the yen weakening again overnight, down 1%, fresh 24-year low. There doesn't seem to be any hint from the Bank of Japan that they're going to step out and continue to be determined with keeping a lid on yields because of the state of the economy.
And yeah, talk us a little bit more about, I mean, obviously what we saw last year with all this extraordinary stimulus, that the one side effect that has been that this housing, boom basically across the world. Your big take today, Enda, is talking about the bubble and the bubbliest housing markets in the world. What sort of signs are we flashing now, given that this could start to unravel with central banks tightening?
Well, this is one of the key concerns, Yvonne. We all know there was extraordinary support put into economies all around the world. Either mortgage rates were brought down to rock bottom levels, or central banks went out and bought a lot of bonds in the markets, and all of that helped to fuel demand. It sent people out there to buy new homes. And the concern now is that that's going to come off as interest rates go up. Mortgage holders will struggle to make those repayments. Some countries are more vulnerable than others. There are still some buffers in the system. Households have savings and the like, but nonetheless, it's a key concern that when you see how interest rates going up at the pace that they are, it will impact consumer demand, and that will feed through to the idea that the world economy is certainly going through a rough patch.
And thank you very much, Enda Curran, our Chief Asia Economics Correspondent. Now, up next, we're going to be looking at this man, the JP Morgan, possibly, of crypto. A closer look at Sam Bankman-Fried's multi-million-dollar efforts to prop up the digital space. Got that coming up just ahead. This is Bloomberg.
Wherever you go in the world, one airline goes further to make it feel exceptional. Qatar Airways, going places together.
I have a number of money managers that advise me on investment strategies, portfolio construction, and asset classes. But sometimes I just want to do a trade by myself. So I went to the App Store and downloaded IBKR Global Trader. No conversations, no messages, no friction, all done in 20 seconds. They have 90 trading venues, 27 currencies, so give it a try. You're going to like the way it works.
In an ever-changing industry, you have to react and adapt. But some things never change. It's in our name, it's in our values, it's in everything we do. Trade global markets with professional trading conditions, proactive rules and services, progressive technology, prominent industry-leading broker, proficient in every way. FX Pro. Trade like a pro.
What do you see when you look at the surface? Just that, the surface. But dive deeper and new possibilities emerge. Essential intelligence from S&P Global takes you here, providing the data, risk assessment, and workflow solutions you need to plumb the wonders beneath. A better, more prosperous future awaits. It's yours for the seeking. S&P Global. Seek and prosper.
Let's get you back to the latest on crypto trading. The bulls appear to be charging back, encouraging buying and flagging the next rally. We've got Sue Keenan joining us now. Sue, got a bit of red on the screen at the moment, at least this hour, but seen a bit of stabilization for Bitcoin in particular. I think it's near $21,000, and there's a view that this so-called crypto winter may have passed. It was quite short.
Just a chill.
No, it was winter, all right. And yeah, the crypto bulls certainly starting to feel that way after the plunge to near 17,000 over the weekend and the comeback to the 21,000 level. As mentioned, a bit of red on the screen. A lot of the gains have been given back. But what's important is that there's been a tentative recovery. A lot of the popular altcoins from Ripple, Cardano, Dogecoin, and Polkadot all rallying as well as Bitcoin. Let's jump into the Bloomberg real quick because is there's a reinforced view now that the 20,000 level is a very strong area of support, and that it did and has held. And so you've got crypto bulls urging investors to buy the dip, keep the faith, and many of the tweets going out there have played on FOMO, fear of missing out. If you don't buy now, you miss the next rally. Bitcoin and other crypto assets have been up as much as 14% from Sunday. Ether, one of the most popular tokens, added about 6.5 at one point in the last 12 hours. But there are many warning that it could be a dead cat bounce. The Benzinga Newswire points out if you invested 1,000 in Bitcoin back when MicroStrategy's Michael Saylor said mortgage your house and buy Bitcoin with it back in 2021, just putting 1,000 in Bitcoin would be worth now about $375, and that explains the caution.
And you have new ETFs out there for investors who think Bitcoin has further to fall. But meanwhile, you're watching this white night for the troubled crypto firms, FTX, I believe.
Yes. Let's start with the ETF. Quickly into the Bloomberg. There's now a new ProShares vehicle that allows you to bet on the decline or to short Bitcoin with it down some 70% from its peak. There's a lot of interest in that. And now to the white knight, the crypto billionaire who co-founded digital asset exchange FTX Trading is providing credit lines to try to stem contagions for his beleaguered industry. There is a tweet from the head of crypto lender BlockFi confirming that they signed papers for about a $250 million line of credit. Over the past week, Voyager Digital got a similar $200 million loan. And a tweet from what some are calling the new JP Morgan billionaire Sam Bankman-Fried. He's very big in the crypto space. He's been bailing out crypto markets the way the original JP Morgan did after the banking crisis of 1907. He believes his leadership role in the crypto world requires him to help other troubled in the industry and to help out customers, even if it's at a loss to his current firms. As we know, there's been a collapse of Terra, USD, and Luna. There's been various other crypto-related banks and funds that have really taken huge losses here, and that has accelerated selling. Hopefully, we're beyond that. Back to you.
Good stuff. Sue Keenan there joining us from New York. Let's get to some of these market movers and some of the stocks that we're watching out for. And I think we're looking at some of these EV makers at least. And I've got one at least which is on an absolute tear right now.
Yeah, that's Li Auto, Rish. But across the board, we are seeing some gains here. We did see Citigroup basically upgrading their price target for the entire sector here. And they're now seeing local EV makers capturing about 85% of the market. As you say, Li Auto here jumping its price target raised to 225 Hong Kong dollars. Flipping the board now to check in on the Aussie copper miners as well. We're seeing some mixed moves here this morning, though we do have a major copper mine in Chile facing a strike, so they could benefit the Aussie miners from that. Meanwhile, also just a quick check on Malaysian chicken producers as well. So we are seeing them surging this morning. Malaysia is removing price caps on chickens.
Right, the hawker stalls in Singapore are certainly happy. Coming up, campaigning for Japan's upper house elections kicks off with a weak yen and rising prices, proving a political headache for the prime minister. More on that next. This is Bloomberg.
We started off as a financial institution, right? So we're regulated by so many authorities. That was actually an advantage for us moving in because it helped us to create lines of what is actually a family conversation versus what is actually a professional conversation in the workspace. And I think that over time, it's as simple as building a habit. The moment we walk into the door in the office, we owe it to ourselves to actually be professional. I don't take any of what I do for granted. And I always like to think of myself as the underdog. It's about doing genuine work and being passionate about what I do and walking in and giving it my best. In KSK, we have a culture that we like to innovate and learn very, very quickly. I believe that whether we fail or we succeed, there's always something to learn.
Bloomberg Generation Next, brought to you by Pictet.
Is this going to primarily be chips for your own business, or is this going to be more centered around the foundry business and external customers?
It's going to be both. And what we said today is we're announcing 2 fab modules. It's a large location, 1,000 acres, because I'd hope to build out a full 8 fabs or more on this location. And, if we do that full project, it would be $100 billion over the course of the decade or so. So a massive project, initially 3,000 jobs, 7,000 construction workers, supply chain, et cetera. I mean, this is just fabulous. And products will be our most leading edge chips. So as we said, this will be the angstrom era when we're going to 2 nanometers and below into the angstrom era. So it'll be the most advanced chips, potentially the largest manufacturing location in the world. We'll use its output for our internal products, but also for those of the foundry customers as well. So it's going to cover both.
All right, there we go. Nikkei started off the day with good gains. It was up by about 0.8%. We just fell below the gain line. In fact, the deltas are quite big today. Volatility, the key, is 1.2% or 1.3% the delta from the way it opened to where it reached its nadir this morning. But we have recovered somewhat. We've got at the moment perhaps investors weighing that tumbling yen, which certainly at the moment is preying on the minds of not just, of course, the market participants, but politicians now as well. Unchanged government 10-year. We've got, of course, a lunch break in Tokyo in about 15 seconds.
Yep, sticking with Japan now, let's bring in Annabelle Jewelers once again. And Annabelle, you're just basically looking at the record buying that we've seen from the BOJ, and pretty soon it seems like the BOJ is going to be the bond market.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Yvonne. We have really seen the Bank of Japan struggling to keep the 10-year yield within that targeted upper end of 0.25%, and it's really barely been able to do that with curves just continuing to rise across the curve here, and of course with that massive bond buying that was seen as well, because the BOJ has already bought 25% more bonds this month than in any other previously, and we've still got around 10 days left in this month. But changing the terminal now, so the consequences of that is that the BOJ really to a place now that it probably never dreamed that it would be in when it did start the QE program in what was supposed to be a temporary measure back in 2001, and that is, as you mentioned, Yvonne, basically owning almost half the JGB balance sheet. So that does show us here that massive balance sheet, but really we are in uncharted territory here. So the BOJ could pass that nadir into the 50% ownership mark as soon as this week. It would be the first major central bank to do so. And as Yvonne said, it really means that the BOJ will be the bond market here. So the implications of that, well, we've never seen this before, so it's hard to tell, but as our Markets Live team points out, that it could actually be very unsettling for these other bond holders in the market with such a lopsided ownership structure. Rish.
Yeah, and of course, we were saying earlier this has a political dimension. Thanks, Annabelle. Annabelle Drill is there. We've got this campaign for the upper house in Japan taking place. It's actually kicked off with this week yen, of course, and loose monetary policy and increasing prices in focus ahead of this vote, which I think is on the 10th of July. Let's get to Yuko Takeo in Tokyo for more on this. Give us a sense of what Kishida inflation is, because that's really what they've been using as a weaponizing tool for the weak yen ahead of those elections coming up.
So opponents are saying the weak yen is exacerbating what inflation in Japan is already seeing, and they're trying to appeal to voters who are facing the highest level of price rises since 2008, excluding tax hike years. We do need to note that compared to the type of price rises we're seeing in the US or Europe, Japan's inflation is still pretty low at around 2.5% overall and 2.1% for core inflation, which is what the BOJ is targeting. But we have to remember that Japan has had deflation for decades, so even a small increase hits voter psychology differently here. We also need to remember that Japan is one of the oldest countries in the world, so a lot of the population are on fixed monthly pension incomes, which means that they're a lot more sensitive to even small price increases here.
Yeah, certainly hitting the households. What has been the government's stance on the BOJ's policies so far, Yuko? Is it more aligned, or are you sensing a bit of clash now?
To be honest, Kishida's reaction to the BOJ's policy so far has been support. He's reacted in that the government has put together supportive policies, especially in terms of fuel subsidies. So that's supposed to help households and businesses. But the stance has been that it is the BOJ's decision. The BOJ needs to keep its independence. So Kishida has stayed away from putting pressure on the BOJ to change its policy so far.
Yuka, there is an old adage about how a weaker currency can cause a lot of harm and pain for particularly the middle class. So ultimately, could this also damage Kishida's campaign because of this reason alone?
It's hard to say how much damage it will actually have. Of course, Kishida has already enjoyed pretty surprising levels of support until now. But it is true that the whole yen weakening inflationary trend we're seeing so far has knocked off some of his support percentage points. So you could see some of the votes going against him because of that still. That said, ultimately, no one is expecting Kishida to lose the election right now. There's still a healthy level of support for Kishida, and the opposition just remains too fragmented to be a real threat to the LDP.
Yuko Takeo there in Tokyo with the latest on the political aspect of all this when it comes to the weaker yen. You take a look when it comes to Southeast Asia markets, it's that dollar strength story that's very much dominating here during the Asia session against what we're counting down to this Jay Powell testimony where he's probably going to recommit to fighting inflation. The dollar is stronger against all of these. You take a look at the Philippine peso, we're basically at 16-year lows for that currency. You continue to see all these central banks like Medallia saying, look, they're pushing against any thoughts of a supersized hike and following the Fed. You sort of heard that with Bank Indonesia in just the last couple of minutes as well, saying that there's no need to really rush when it comes to raising rates. Same for the Thailand central bank as well. You have the Malaysian ringgit also, but for the Thailand, the baht dropping for a 9th day. You see stock and bond outflows going there as well. We also do have that BSP decision later on Thursday.
Absolutely. Now we know that the right to bear arms is enshrined in the Constitution, but what type of arms should they bear? Let's get now to the First Word News with Vonnie Quinn in New York.
Well, there might be changes, Rich. Bipartisan negotiators in the Senate have reached an agreement on new gun legislation, with lawmakers now discussing the timing for releasing the text of the deal. Senators restarted talks on gun safety in the wake of the school shooting in Uvalde, Texas last month. The new measures will include better background checks, crisis intervention programs, and safety at schools. Ray Dalio has written on LinkedIn saying it's naive to think the Fed raising interest rates will make things better. He argues that while tightening may reduce inflation, it'll also squeeze consumer buying power. Dalio added that private credit will also shrink due to the government deficit and the Fed selling debt. He concludes the fight to tame inflation can only create economic weakness. The U.S. military is banning the use of anti-personnel landmines. The U.S. has a stockpile of about 3 million mines it says it will work to destroy. An exception is being made for South Korea, which uses them in its defenses against the North. The White House says the mines have a disproportionate impact on civilians, including children. Human Rights Watch calls the move good, but not good enough. Australia's wine marketing and research body is closing its physical office in Shanghai. High tariffs have made business unviable in what was once the most prized market for Aussie winemakers. Back in 2020, worsening relations led to Beijing suddenly imposing import duties of more than 200% on Australian products. Exports to mainland China plummeted by 97% in 2021. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Vonnie Quinn. This is Bloomberg. Rich.
Okay, we are looking at Elon Musk saying a recession is inevitable at some point, more likely suggesting in the near term.
Yeah, our exclusive interview with Elon Musk there at the Qatar Economic Forum in Doha. Our editor-in-chief, John Mickelhway, also asked for an update on his Twitter takeover plan.
With respect to the Twitter transaction, there's a limit to what I can say publicly, given that it is somewhat of a sensitive matter. So I will have to be measured in my responses here, such as not to generate incremental lawsuits. Unfortunately,
that seems to be a risk you sometimes manage to overcome.
Yes, a deposition anonymization is, I think, important.
Have Twitter given you enough information?
Well, there are still a few unresolved matters. You've probably read about the question as to whether the number of fake and spam users on the system is less than 5%, as Twitter claims, which I think is probably not most people's experience when using Twitter. So we're still awaiting resolution on that matter, and that is a very significant matter. So we're awaiting resolution on that. And then, of course, there is the question of will the debt portion of the round come together, and then will the shareholders vote in favor? So I think those are the three things that stand in the that need to be resolved before the transaction can complete.
What about the general state of the economy? Does that weigh on you when you think about this? I mean, you just described it. You have a super bad feeling about the economy. Are you still in that position? I just said to you earlier, Joe Biden has just come out and said that a recession in America is not inevitable. How do you feel about the economy?
Well, I think a recession is inevitable at some point. As to whether there is a recession in the near term, I think it's more likely than not. It certainly isn't. It's not a certainty, but it appears more likely than not. What do you think?
I'm with you. I agree with you. I think it's more likely. Can I ask you one particular thing to do with the Twitter bid, which is, you are one of the biggest and fastest growing investors in China. Tesla, you've talked about it being a third of your sales going forward. You're now buying Twitter, the kind of public forum for free speech. The Chinese historically don't tend to be very enthusiastic about free speech. Are you worried about whether you can keep those two particular horses running? Is buying Twitter going to get you in trouble with the Chinese?
Well, Twitter does not operate in China. Yes. So, and I think China does not attempt to interfere with the free speech of the press in the U.S. As far as I know, because I assume you're not under pressure at Bloomberg from China. So I think there's. I don't think this is going to be an issue.
And in terms generally of that issue of freedom of speech and Twitter, you've talked about Twitter making it even freer and letting more people onto it. Is there a limit at all to who you think should be allowed onto Twitter?
Well, my aspiration for Twitter, or in general for the digital town square, would be that it is as inclusive in the broader sense of the word as possible, that it is an appealing system to use. So, I mean, ideally, I'd like to get like 80% of, let's say, North America, and perhaps, I don't know, half the world or something, ultimately on Twitter in one form or another. And that means it must be something that is appealing to people. It obviously cannot be a place where they feel uncomfortable or harassed, or they'll simply not use it.
Elon Musk there, speaking with our very own editor-in-chief, John Micklethwaite, at that Qatar Economic Forum in Doha. Looking at oil prices, just very briefly at the moment, we've got WTI down to levels we haven't seen for something like 4 weeks. Yeah. This is ahead of a meeting between President Biden's team and oil executives. And don't forget, he's also been perhaps calling for a gasoline tax holiday. Yeah, and then also you have the Jay Powell testimony. I think it's just nerves leading up to this testimony and what he's really going to say, the recession risks and the slowdown effects here. So you're starting to see that play out in the commodities markets as well. 3% losses here for Brent and New York crude. And you're seeing Brent at around $110. Gas futures continue to be in the red as well. Coming up to celebrate Pride Month, Hong Kong Marriage Equality joins us to discuss how the current political climate in the city is impacting the fight for rights. Their co-founder joins us next. This is Bloomberg.
This data update is brought to you by HKEX. Connecting China, connecting the world. This data update was brought to you by HKEX.
This is Mark. And this is a car, a sofa, a bag. But since Mark has been trading with Capital.com, he started seeing things a little differently. He sees a brand, he sees value, he sees an investment. It might go up or it might go down. But what Mark sees is opportunity all around him. Join more than 3 million users in over 100 countries and start seeing the world differently with Capital.com.
Take the world by cloud. Accenture, let there be change.
This is Bloomberg Markets. Hong Kong's LGBTQ advocates say that the territory's crackdown on social activism is threatening to undo progress on equal rights, particularly with the current climate rather dispiriting.
Our next guest runs an advocacy group that aims to implement strategies to achieve marriage equality in Hong Kong. Jerome Yao is co-founder of Hong Kong Marriage Equality. He joins us here in the studio. Jerome, so yes, of course, the goal is to reach some sort of equality in the city. Do you think the political backdrop now is really going to start to hamper your efforts?
Well, I think obviously we need to take into account the new legal requirements when we do our work. But deep down, the fundamental, point about marriage equality, it's about human. It is a social issue. It's nothing really political about it. So I believe as long as we do things within the boundaries of the law, then things should be okay.
Sure, this is the problem. How has society changed with regards to this issue and its views on it compared to perhaps the administration and the people in power? Is there now a growing rift? What's the deal?
It's nothing really unusual. If you look back at the history of how different places advance their equal marriage in their places, I think most of the time governments were really behind society all the time. So I'm even talking about Western democratic countries. Like even we could have a situation where the government of the day could be with a liberal political background, but they were not quite ready until really either, for example, people in that place demonstrated a strong support or maybe full court action. So in that regard, I think there's nothing really new.
There's been a lot of talk of Michael Vidler, one of the human rights lawyers, leaving Hong Kong and moving to the UK. Is there a sense now of a threat that potentially all these banks and companies that basically have been quite forthcoming and supporting LGBTQ rights, that this whole crackdown on common prosperity in China is going to have a chilling effect on where businesses are going to view this or support rights in the future?
Well, all I can speak is for the situation which I'm seeing right now. It's obviously things happening across the border will, to a certain extent, have an impact here in Hong Kong. But I mean that it's all doom and gloom, I just don't think so. I think Hong Kong is Hong Kong. We are still an international financial center. The government here actually, it's good to make it clear that it's on its official website. It does say that it supports equal opportunities for people of different sexual orientation and gender identities. So there's a fundamental difference.
Yeah.
But there's also a rub with, of course, Chinese culture, however it's perceived right now, and what we have here. And to Yvonne's allusion, how far are rights being at the moment advanced by business rather than perhaps administrators?
I think the role of the business community is very important. Now, obviously, the fact of the matter is in Hong Kong, when it comes to LGBT plus equality, I think a lot of the progress that we have seen, we really have to thanks to the courts. But at the same time, the voice of the business community is very, very important, because at the end of the day, we're talking about an international financial center that has to attract best talent from around the world, and obviously there's an impetus for businesses to make their workplace inclusive in order to attract people from all around the world. So, from that perspective, I would say over the years, the role of the business community has been very important, and especially here in Hong Kong, obviously multinationals have been playing a leading role, but now that I'm seeing actually local companies are picking up, and I think that's a good sign.
I asked this question to a guest previously about what the model is. Obviously Taiwan is the only area in Asia where they recognize same-sex marriage. Can Hong Kong ever achieve that?
Possibly. I never say never to begin with. I think it's still a long road. I would say it's not something going to happen within the next 2 or 3 years. I think it will take some time, but I think one thing is, I think if we look at the sentiment here in society, according to a CUHK survey back in 2020, 49% of the people were supportive. 23% were they opposed, and then basically 28% said neutral. I think if we take that findings, I think the numbers were encouraging and still encouraging today. And I guess since you brought up the situation in Taiwan now, according to my recollection, just before Taiwan legalized same-sex marriage, the support level among the population, it was not more than 50%. I think 40-something. But now that it's gone up to around 60%.
Jerome,
yep.
Okay. The thing is, how do we get there? That's the fundamental point, isn't it? We could talk about what's going on, whatever, but how do we actually get there?
Well, I think more people have to talk about it. I think visibility, it's key. More people talk about it. Business community can speak louder. I mean, obviously, I mentioned earlier on, companies are taking notice and doing something, and I think
especially with a new leader coming in here.
Yeah. Anyway, I would say local companies can take a more visible lead in telling the government that look, times have changed, and we need all these policies to make our place more friendly. And at the end of the day, it makes Hong Kong looks good. Yeah?
Jerome, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Jerome Yeo from Hong Kong Marriage Equality. Good, Marcus is just checking in with what's going on at the Korea right now, because what we have is the Korean won falling to a 13-year low. This is down to, of course, interest rate differentials and also stock outflows as well. Yvonne.
Yeah, you see what we've been seeing in the tech sector. Some of these kind of tech-heavy benchmarks are certainly going to see those outflows, given what we saw in the U.S. in the last week or so. This rebound, basically, in Asia, not really trickling in here. And you're seeing the won just below 1,300. We continue to see 136 handle for dollar-yen. The peso's at 2005 lows, and the Thai baht as well. 9 straight days of losses today. Plenty more ahead. This is Bloomberg.
We are the lions, the guardians that stand the test of time, generation after generation.
In a world full of uncertainty, there's one thing you can rely on. The world's #1 broker. Dedicated to innovation, superior trade execution, award-winning platforms and services, renowned for reliability, passion for excellence, driven to succeed. Trade with the best. Trade with the pros. FX Pro. Trade like a pro.
A quick check of the latest business flash headlines. Volvo's Chinese owner is going public via a blank check merger with a SPAC company, Gorgeous Guggenheim. The SPAC says it expects to close the deal on Thursday, with the Polestar stock to start trading Friday under the symbol PSNY. The transaction should raise at least $850 million to help fund future models. Sumitomo Mitsui is said to be preparing to take a stake in SBI Holdings. Sources say Japan's second largest banking group plans to hold as much as 10% of SBI, a stake valued at about $443 million. In 2020, the two companies had agreed to collaborate in a strategic and capital alliance where their units would cooperate in digital and other fields.
Just quickly checking in on some of the currencies in play at the moment. We've got a lot of price action with this dollar strength just creeping in again, and seeing the yen there continually weak. One, of course, they've just been mentioning that we haven't seen this currency at these levels since 2009. 13-year lows. Filipino peso, one of the worst performing currencies in Asia right now. And again, this is down to the state perhaps of what's their response to interest rates and the like here as well. So there we go. But also in focus, economy focus there coming from the Monetary Policy Committee as well. So that's a look at also the markets overall. Futures currently just moving to the downside as we also see these Asian indices following suit. Of course, Jay Powell appearing before the Senate later today.
Yeah, there goes that stock rebound, right? I think we got to wait until let's get through Wednesday. With Jay Powell first, or even Thursday. HS Tech is down some 2% right now. You take a look at GMM, yeah, you're basically seeing risk-off moves here. There is that bid for treasuries here as well as bond markets here in Asia amidst this risk-off session. Dollar a bit firmer, and we continue to see commodities deep in the red. This is Bloomberg.
I have a number of money managers that advise me on investment strategies, portfolio construction, and asset classes. But sometimes I just want to do a trade by myself. So I went to the App Store and downloaded IBKR Global Trader. No conversations, no messages, no friction, all done in 20 seconds. They have 90 trading venues, 27 currencies, so give it a try. You're going to like the way it works.
Oil prices are surging.
The world can be a noisy place.
Stock prices are set to soar.
But what if under all the noise was opportunity? Would you hear it? Would you see it? And if you did, would you take action? Join more than 3 million users in over 100 countries and be empowered with Capital.com.
Equip yourself with everything you need to know the key economics, earnings, and events set to move the markets across the Asia Pacific and around the world. Every Monday, we bring you Bloomberg Week Ahead from our studios in New York and Sydney. Get a head start on your investment decisions, driven by Bloomberg's exclusive data and analysis. That's Bloomberg Week Ahead on Daybreak Australia.
The Week Ahead, brought to you by IC Markets.
Every art institution I know of wants you to serve on their board, and you're very involved in the art world. What is it about art that attracts you?
Well, art is essential in a democracy, David. Art is so important. We know what art does to young people. We know that exposure to art brings about higher levels of empathy. It helps people understand how other cultures, other people live, and it just brings out the kind of humanity in all of us. There are times when I have observed leaders use language that is inhumane while talking about other human beings, while talking about the world. And I think to myself, this person has clearly never engaged in beautiful poetry. They've never listened to the words of a great playwright. They've never sat and reflected on a beautiful painting or picture. Because if they had been really educated, had they really been exposed to the arts, they wouldn't find it possible to use this kind of language.
The Indian city of Jamnagar is a money-making machine for Asia's richest man, Mukesh Ambani. His company Reliance has the world's biggest oil refinery complex here in the city. Jamnagar is also where Ambani is making his newest bet, a $10 billion investment in green energy. His ambition is closely aligned with the Indian government's plan to reach net zero emissions by 2070. But Ambani is not alone. India's second richest man, Gautam Adani, has committed $20 billion of investment over the next decade. But India's massive dependencies on fossil fuels have some environmental advocates questioning the realism and sincerity of those green ambitions and those of its two biggest billionaires.
It is almost 11 a.m. here in Singapore and in Shanghai. Welcome to Bloomberg Markets Asia. I'm Juliet Sali.
I'm Rashad Salamat in Hong Kong. Let's have a look at our top stories. We've got Asian equities struggling to build on a Wall Street rebound as ever louder recession warnings weigh on sentiment. Focus now turning to the Federal Reserve's chairman's appearance on Capitol Hill.
China ratchets up calls to boost its COVID-battered economy, promising pro-growth policies and urging banks to step up lending.
Plus, India set to resist any anti-US messaging at this week's BRICS summit if China and Russia seek a propaganda platform.
Well, the calm didn't last long, Rish. We had that good gain yesterday, the first gain in Asian equities in 9 sessions, but now we're starting to see a downturn in US equity futures despite that relief rally on Wall Street. That was spurred by President Biden saying a recession isn't inevitable, but of course these recessionary calls are growing, and that is very much weighing into investor sentiment. We are seeing Asian stocks on the back foot once again, led by some big losses. Bit better. Remember, we've got these pro-growth policies helping to give a little bit of a support there. But really, one of the only markets in the black today is New Zealand's market. When it comes to the currency picture, I'm going to let you delve into that a little bit more. But we have been seeing some big moves today. The peso falling to a 16-year low against the dollar. Of course, bonds bid quite well today. You've got New Zealand's 2-year off by 10 basis points. A big drop in the 2-year in Australia. Of course, we had that repricing yesterday as well after we heard from Governor Lowe. And then when we're looking at the oil market, we're nowhere awaiting Jay Powell's testimony. We're also awaiting whether or not we're going to get this gasoline relief in the US. Brent crude down by 3%, WTI off almost 4%, holding at $105 a barrel, Wish.
Okay, let's quickly just check in with the set just opening there in Bangkok. Have a look at the price action there. As we see also negativity of 0.3% lower. Look at the baht though. It's now down for a 9th day. We've got foreign funds selling the country's bonds and equities. In fact, the 9-day gain for the dollar is now taken into about to a 3% rise here. And this also perhaps being the good news being largely ignored as we've had Thai GDP forecasts at the moment upped slightly here as well. In fact, the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of Thailand suggesting that the economy could expand faster than anticipated this year. Looking elsewhere at currencies as well, just looking at the yen, which again, fresh 24-year lows for the currency there. Korean won also feeling it as we've got outflows and interest rate differentials all playing out with regards to that one, and we haven't seen it at these levels since 2009. Filipino peso, there we go, and it is also suffering, one of the worst performers, of course, in this part of the world. We've got the peso dropping to, at one stage, 54.45. We exceeded that now, and we're at a new low. In fact, we're at the weakest level for the peso since 2005. Juliet.
Let's get more now from Bloomberg's Chief Asia FX and Rate Strategist, Stephen Chu. Stephen, a lot of this weakness coming through in these currencies here in Asia has happened in the last hour or so. We know it's about the differentials in terms of rates and the outlook. Rish also mentioning with the Korean won, this stock outflow. But tell us what you're seeing.
Actually, this is totally expected and it's in line with our view since the beginning of the year. It's the same old story. We get a more hawkish Fed, we get higher US rates and a stronger dollar across the board. And if you look at Asia, like there's no way that Asia can hike rates as fast as the Fed. At least that's for market pricing. So in that case, dollar Asia is going to go up and most of the Asian currencies will be under pressure, as you can see today. Especially the South Korean won, it has been our least favorite for the year, for the quarter, just because the Korean won tends to be very sensitive to risk sentiment. Hence, if when you see equity underperforming, it's going to drop. It's also very sensitive to the global economic cycle. So when we are talking about stagflation, not just in the US, but everywhere, the Korean won drops. Also, it's very sensitive to equity flows, especially tech equity. And at a high interest rate environment, it's going to hurt Korean equities. Hence, the won will drop as well. So adding everything together, and this very last important driver is actually Korean rely a lot on oil and food imports. So when we are talking about higher oil prices, when we are talking about higher food prices, even entering the second half of the year, that's going to hurt the trade balance for South Korea. And that's also another headwind for the won. Hence, we are not surprised to see the won weakness. And we think the 1300 handle could be tested for the South Korean won.
Stephen, we can look at the yen now, if you may. Is there a line in the sand as to how weak it can go? People have been talking about 140. They've also been talking about 150. And at the same time, you also like this sort of haven play here as well, being long a Swiss franc against the yen. I mean, the Swiss franc behaving like the old German mark used to.
That's correct. I've said a couple of times on TV actually that we still see higher dollar yen just purely because right now it's a US yield play. So as long as the Fed hawkishness stays, market try to push the US Treasury yield higher, then we're going to see a higher dollar yen as long as the BOJ does nothing. Now, for example, remember that last week we were saying a 10-year US Treasury yield at 325. That means the 10-year gap with the JGB at 300 basis point, that translates into a dollar yen at around 136, 137. And now we are there. So right now, I would say the level is completely fair. Now going forward, the view of, is that our US chief rate strategists expect the US Treasury yield, the 10-year yield, to rise higher. Because right now, breaking all the technical levels, the next level, we are talking about 377. So at 377, we're talking about a dollar yen that's roughly at around 140. So definitely, unless the BOJ does something, we think that 140 is completely possible. Now, we like the Swiss franc against the yen just because we're also very wary of the risk of environment. And the Swiss franc it's actually second to the dollar only, and it's better than yen just because the S&P has hiked surprisingly last week. And they are also very eager and committed to fight inflation. So the BOJ does nothing, the S&P may hike further. That actually brings a Swiss franc a better choice compared to the yen.
When we look at the yen
right
versus the yuan, Stephen, sorry. If we look at the yuan now, I mean, we're talking about this 24-year low against the dollar, but a near 30-year low against the yuan. Tell us why a weak yen matters to the yuan, but I guess only moderately here.
It matters to some extent just because China right now, they actually have a basket strategy. So they look at basket of currency. So if we get a strong dollar across the board that actually weakens the yen, then the yuan will have to weaken against the dollar. So a weaker yen will drive the yuan lower against the dollar as long as China wants a stable basket. So that's why, like from the look of it, you see a weaker yen translate into a weaker yuan. But this is completely not the same as competitive devaluation, just because, as you said, like the yuan is actually strengthening against the yen. So China is not trying to push down the currency and compete with the yen. And more importantly, the yen wasn't as important as the 90s. Because right now, if you look at the share of global reserve currency, the yen actually fell from over 10% in the 90s to right now to just about 5%, whereas the yuan is getting more important, globally speaking. So we think higher China yen is possible, and China will not competitive devaluate the currency.
Stephen Chu, the Chief Asia FX and Rates Strategist. We're going to now get more on-market action. Have a look also at what's happening in the commodities complex, because we're certainly getting some of these hot commodities cooling off right now. And looking, first of all, at the crude market with MLife strategist Mark Cranfield. Mark, give us a sense of this meeting taking place between President Biden's team and oil executives, and talk right now of a gasoline tax holiday.
Obviously, gasoline prices are a very thorny issue for the United States, especially for the White House. Prices above $5 a gallon is obviously something that the US can't live with for too long. It's extremely unpopular. There's midterm elections this year. The summer driving season's only just begun. So there's a whole host of reasons why President Biden and his team would want to try and get those prices down. So there's obviously some trepidation about what kind of pressure he might be able to apply to the oil men when he meets, or when his team meets them sometime this week. He also has been reaching out to Saudi Arabia, and it's thought that he's going to go and meet in person in Saudi Arabia and try and talk them into more oil production as well. So it's a major issue politically for Biden. That means the markets have to pay attention very closely to what it means. We're seeing a bit of a sell-off here in terms of the general risk aversion. Obviously includes oil as well. It's been pushing up just recently back to the $120. So now the market's probably a bit too long on that positioning, so they're starting to trim that. But certainly if Biden can make any kind of a deal with Saudi Arabia or his own oil at home, that certainly will undermine the prices for oil.
Mark, when it comes to the overall risk sentiment, I mean, the calm didn't last very long. Why do you think we are seeing such panic selling coming in today again? Is it because of Jay Powell's testimony?
It probably is a part of it. I don't think we can point to any one significant thing today, but we certainly did see an acceleration in risk aversion after the dollar yuan fixing today. The PBOC fixed the rate quite a bit higher than people were expecting, even higher than where the spot rate was trading, which is unusual. And people seem to be a little bit spooked by that. Obviously, they saw dollar yen above 136 today. So no wonder Stephen was talking about such weakness in the Asian currencies. Today's fixing from the PBOC was a signal that they're not too happy about what's going on. So certainly the market got spooked by that. Then on top of that, also the Jerome Powell meeting with senators today could, again, he's going to come under pressure because he hasn't got ahead of inflation, and the senators will probably be goading him into saying something pretty hawkish. So that's not good for risk sentiment either.
All right, MLive strategist Mark Cranfield, thank you as always from Singapore. Well, a reminder of the market's live question of the day: have US stocks priced in Fed hikes? You can share your thoughts at marketslive@bloomberg.net. You can also get commentary and analysis on today's top market themes by going to MLIV Go on the terminal. Let's head to New York now and get the first word news with Vonnie Quinn. Hey, Vonnie.
Hey, Juliette, good morning. Beijing is ratcheting up calls to boost China's COVID-battered economy. The finance minister Liu Kun says more pro-growth policies are being studied, while a newspaper affiliated with the cabinet urged banks to step up infrastructure lending. State media quote Liu discussing plans for new policy tools and front-loaded stimulus to keep economic growth within a reasonable range. The world's richest person says the US economy is heading for a recession in the near future. That's Elon Musk, and he joins the growing list of business leaders warning of rising risks of a contraction. His call, though, puts him at odds with President Biden, who says a recession is not inevitable. Musk was speaking to Bloomberg's editor-in-chief, John Micklethwaite, at the Qatar Economic Forum in Doha.
A recession is inevitable at some point. As to whether there is a recession in the near term, I think that is more likely than not. It certainly isn't. It's not a certainty, but it appears more likely than not.
A top Russian official is threatening to retaliate in a growing standoff with the European Union. That's after Lithuania blocked the transit of sanctioned goods to the Baltic territory of Kaliningrad. The Secretary of Russia's Security Council says his country will respond to hostile actions and warned Lithuania of serious negative impact. Torrential monsoon rains in parts of India have caused deadly floods and landslides, killing at least 300 people and displacing millions. The monsoon arrived in India at the end of May and is set to last through September. It contributes to the deaths of hundreds of people in India every year. However, it is also one of the most important seasons for farmers in a country that's dependent on agriculture. Global News 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Vonnie Quinn. This is Bloomberg. Rich.
Thanks, Ronnie. Right, so to come this hour, we're going to look at what Standard Chartered Wealth Management is making of the environment out there, getting their top strategies and looking at what they perceive as being key risks to the market, and talking to the senior strategist there, Abhilash Narayan. That's next, but later this hour, we'll discuss the state of India-Afghanistan relations and international engagement with Taliban administration. Going to be doing that with Afghanistan's ambassador to India. This is Bloomberg.
This data update is brought to you by HKEX. Connecting China, connecting the world. This data update was brought to you by HKEX.
We started off as a financial institution, right? So we're regulated by so many authorities. That was actually an advantage for us moving in because it helped us to create lines of what is actually a family conversation versus what is actually a professional conversation in the workspace. And I think that over time, it's as simple as building a habit. The moment we walk into the door in the office, we owe it to ourselves to actually be professional. I don't take any of what I do for granted. And I always like to think of myself as the underdog. It's about doing genuine work and being passionate about what I do and walking in and giving it my best. In KSK, we have a culture that we like to innovate and learn very, very quickly. I believe that whether we fail or we succeed, there's always something to learn.
Bloomberg Generation Next, brought to you by Pictet.
This is an urgent appeal from UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. As conflict and tragedy strike Ukraine, the world is watching and worrying, desperate to save their lives and protect loved ones. Some have fled within their country, while others have sought safety across borders. Most are women and youth, and a heartbreaking amount of children are arriving in neighbouring countries alone. Please go online and give what you can today.
Is it the most difficult job in politics? Your job?
I would say it is unprecedented and unique. I can't find many situations where the head of the government has two bosses.
Is there anything you would like to apologize for to the Hong Kong people?
No.
A recession is inevitable at some point.
It's almost unavoidable. I got to think that the odds are that there's going to be a recession. Seeing a cooling of the economy is something that we believe is appropriate.
As to whether there is a recession in the near term, I think that is more likely than not.
We're going to have kind of a tough period here.
Our economists, as you've noted this morning, have increased their odds of a recession this year, but really more focused into next year.
If we can stabilize the energy market, I believe when the Fed does their job, we'll have inflation under control. Inflation's not going to cure itself.
There will be, again, more surprises and more shocks coming from central banks.
I think this inflation is quite bad. It's intransigent. It's not transitory, and the consequence will be a recession.
Just some of the big names speaking to us on recession risks at the Qatar Economic Forum.
Well, our next guest, Rish, says his checklist is showing new warnings that the US economy faces some moderate recession risk. Let's bring in Abhilash Narayan, Senior Investment Strategist at Standard Chartered Wealth Management, who is with me here in the Singapore studio. Great to have you with us. I guess a lot of the question is how deep a recession could be if this is what we are facing and how much has been priced in. So just talk about your view here.
Well, ultimately, how deep the recession ends up being depends on the Fed trajectory in terms of hiking rates. So if you think that the Fed manages to somewhat achieve a soft landing, then we think that the recession could be shallower than the past couple of recessions. But obviously, it's something that is still a developing story.
Let's talk then about our question of the day, which is more focused on whether or not US stocks are priced in these Fed hikes. I know you're looking at the bond market too, and the bond market here does seem to be a little bit ahead of the curve.
Yes, absolutely. So if you think about US Treasuries or even corporate bond markets, we think that they have priced in a recession risk to a much larger degree as compared to the equity markets. Now, if you look at US equities in the last, 8 or 10 recessions, they have declined by an average of 27% in the recessionary period. So given that we are already in bear market, it's fair to say that equities have priced in a fair bit of recession risk as well. But there is a fair bit of variability around that as well. So in 2007, for instance, equities declined by more than 50%. So we think there's a bit more downside to equities as compared to bonds.
I mean, actually, you can look at quite a few data points, and we've got a chart showing them, which suggests that we are nowhere near a recession right now. And, of course, you can be a la carte about these things. These NBER indicators don't show that such a slowdown is imminent, at least right now, given the four components: employment, household employment, also real consumer spending, and also incomes as well. But then you overlay other aspects as well. You've seen consumer confidence, Michigan Consumer Confidence Index, down to record lows we haven't seen since 1977 when that data series started. So Abhilash, the thing is, those four data points belie the actual confidence being polled by the consumer or of the consumer.
Yes, absolutely. And we all know that predicting a recession is an incredibly hard thing to do. So if I look at the recession checklist that we have, obviously the risks have risen, but we still think that, a recession is a 2023 story. So we will continue to see slowdown in US economic data as we go through 2022. And the growth may slow down to below trend level, but we should, avoid a recession at least this year, unless we see a further hawkish surprise from the Fed.
Well, the thing is, they probably have to get hawkish. And, we look at just the inflationary threat here. There's always the fiat of money dictates when you print the stuff, you end up with prices going up. And let's have a look at M1, money supply here. It's up 400% since March of 2020. If that means that we've got more notes and coins in circulation, something like 4 trillion dollars worth, to what we have at the moment at 20.6 trillion. So that is a system completely awash with money, and you've got a central bank trying to reduce the amount it has on its balance sheet. Well, this is likely to hurt.
Yes, absolutely. But if you think about what's the driver for recession risk, right? It's been the rapid pace of central hikes that has been priced in because of the inflationary pressures. But at the end of the day, the inflation is being driven by supply side, right? So commodity prices, food prices have risen a lot, and that's driving inflation. And there's only limited effectiveness when we think about rate hikes in terms of curbing the supply side inflationary pressures. So yes, obviously central banks will hike rates, but it's unlikely to have a lot of impact in terms of curbing supply side inflation. And the other part which is important, is obviously the job market. So job markets in US and Europe continue to be fairly strong. So we think that that's a fairly strong pillar as far as the economy is concerned.
A lot of the pain could still be to come. I mean, everybody is facing rising prices, as you say, from food inflation, very much a threat. How do you hedge against this? Because I know you've got gold as a potential here, and that is something that we don't hear very often anymore. It's one of those old inflationary hedges, but you're sticking with it.
Yes, absolutely. So obviously it's very difficult to hedge against the kind of inflationary environment that we are seeing. But when we think about the geopolitical risks that are there, we think that gold makes sense as a hedge from a geopolitical risk angle as well. And as far as inflation is concerned, obviously gold hasn't really performed as well as people would have hoped for in the last 6 to 8 months. But let's not forget, gold has a 2,000-year history behind it, and it has worked as a good hedge. So we think that when we think about the risks facing equity markets and even bond markets to a certain degree, gold still makes sense to have an overweight allocation to it.
Stick with the tried, true and trusted. Okay, thank you so much. Abhilash Narayan from Standard Chartered Wealth Management with us in Singapore. Rish.
All right, just got this US Chinese household consumer goods retailer seeking approval of a dual primary listing with the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. They're going to be doing this in a hearing apparently as soon as Thursday. Having a look at what's going on, this company, of course, is, as I said, a consumer goods company. It is a holding company. It retails home decor, small electronics, textiles, accessories, beauty tools, and the like. There we go. Looking at getting this HKEX listing as soon as Thursday. There we go. Looking for that one? Looking at more coming up ahead. This is Blue Moon.
Take you somewhere new. Show me burgundy sunset sky. Let's fly. To fly, to fly, to
Wherever you go in the world, one airline goes further to make it feel exceptional. Qatar Airways, going places together.
In an ever-changing industry, you have to react and adapt. But some things never change. It's in our name, it's in our values, it's in everything we do. Trade global markets with professional trading conditions, proactive tools and services, progressive technology, prominent industry-leading broker, proficient in every way. FX Pro. Trade like a pro.
This is Mark. And this is a car, a sofa, a bag. But since Mark has been trading with Capital.com, he's started seeing things a little differently. He sees a brand, he sees value, he sees an investment. It might go up or it might go down. But what Mark sees is opportunity all around him. Join more than 3 million users in over 100 countries and start seeing the world differently with Capital.com.
You're watching Bloomberg Markets Asia. Look at that drop that we are seeing in the oil market, and the Bloomberg Commodity Index down 1.5%. We have got these recessionary fears really rattling investors in the crude market, and US President Biden set to call for a gasoline tax holiday after the recent spike we've been seeing in oil. Of course, we're awaiting Fed Chair Jay Powell, also due to testify on this drive to try and rein in inflation. Well, the head of the world's largest independent oil trade, meanwhile, says recovering Chinese demand would support prices. Vitol Group CEO Russell Hardy spoke to us at the Qatar Economic Forum.
It's had a very tough 2Q from a demand perspective and a lockdown perspective. So there's quite a bit of growth to bounce back. And obviously the speed at which that comes is quite a concern for the market. Refining capacity has been held back a little bit. Product exports have been held back a little bit so that they look after their own supply and demand whilst they're in this difficult situation with COVID and the international supply picture. And so I think we'd certainly expect demand to increase by at least 1 million barrels a day in China, and that will be supportive for international prices.
How about in terms of demand for Europe and the US? We have expectations of a slowdown in both economies.
Yeah, I think the real concern in Europe is really going to be around diesel this winter. As we move away from Russian diesel, where are we going to find adequate diesel supplies? So the market's got time to adjust and move supplies from other continents towards Europe. But I think that's one of the things that's really driving prices, is the concern around diesel.
That's the Vitol Group Chief Executive Russell Hardy speaking to our very own Haslinda Armin. Markets looking like this, 30 at the moment, turning tail. We've got US equity futures down about 0.9%, nearly 1% right now for NASDAQ and S&P. Looking here also at the Hang Seng Tech Index, dragging down the HSI, the Hang Seng proper, if you will. Weakness, though, also there for Chinese equities. Japan just about positive as we head to the reopen there, and we've got currencies under pressure. Japanese yen at 24-year lows, won at 13-year lows, and the peso at lows not seen since 16 years, and the oil price much weaker too.
We started off as a financial institution, right? So we're regulated by so many authorities. That was actually an advantage for us moving in, because it helped us to create lines of what is actually a family conversation versus what is actually a professional conversation in the workplace. And I think that over time, it's as simple as building a habit. The moment we walk into the door in the office, we owe it to ourselves to actually be professional. I don't take any of what I do for granted. And I always like to think of myself as the underdog. It's about doing genuine work and being passionate about what I do and walking in and giving it my best. In KSK, we have a culture that we like to innovate and learn very, very quickly. I believe that whether we fail or we succeed, there's always something to learn.
Bloomberg Generation Next, brought to you by Pictet.
The two forces that got us from 110, 115 to the 130, 135 range are still in place. We've got a widening interest rate differential. Those forces are likely to stay in place. So as far as I'm concerned, we're in for further yen depreciation towards 150, 160.
Given that we do have some level of inflationary pressure, what change does Japan need most at the moment?
I think Governor Kuroda tells you exactly what you need to look for. He wants to see demand pull inflation. So I am watching like a hawk any data point on domestic travel. If that starts to recover and accelerate, then yes, the Bank of Japan will change its mind.
11:29 a.m. there in Shanghai. Chinese markets going on a break in less than a minute, and this is what we have. We've seen them really come off any positivity that they did have, looking for moves to the downside. But some remarks just being made currently. We've got China and Chinese authorities vowing and ratcheting up calls to boost their economy. Of course, one which has been battered by COVID. And in light of that, we just had reports that COVID cases in China itself are at lows not seen for 4 months, as the threat of these curbs does remain, however, though, as well. Country's finance minister also saying that more needs to be done to engender growth, and certain policies are being studied. And we've got a newspaper affiliated with the cabinet urging banks to step up lending for infrastructure projects. In fact, China Merchants Bank, though, in light of that, one of the weakest equities on those markets. Juliet.
All right, let's check in on Japan as it comes back out of that lunch break. It certainly seems that that calm in Asian markets did not last long as we start to see US equity futures wobble following that relief rally on Wall Street. But of course, there's still these recessionary concerns, those calls growing louder, and we're also looking ahead to Fed Chair Jay Powell's semi-annual testimony to Congress. The Nikkei down by about 0.2%. As we see the yen just edge slightly higher from those 24-year lows. Quite a bit of weakness in Hong Kong, South Korea. We've been talking about the won at this 2009 low, and the ASX 200 holding up relatively okay, down by about 0.2%. Let's head to New York now and get the first word news with Bonnie Quinn. Bonnie.
Juliet, thank you. Bipartisan negotiators in the Senate have reached an agreement on new gun legislation, with lawmakers now discussing the timing for releasing the text of the deal. Senators restarted talks on gun safety in the wake of the school shooting in Uvalde, Texas last month. The new measures will include better background checks, crisis intervention programs, and safety at schools. Ray Dalio has written on LinkedIn saying it's naive to think the Fed raising interest rates will make things better. He argues that while tightening may reduce inflation, it'll also squeeze consumer buying power. Dalio added that private credit will also shrink due to the government deficit and the Fed selling debt. He concludes the fight to tame inflation can only create economic weakness. Richmond Fed President Thomas Barkin says the Fed should raise rates as fast as it can without causing undue harm to the markets or the economy. Barkin is not a monetary policy voter this year, but says he supported the central bank's 75 basis point hike earlier this month. He said the Fed may need to raise rates beyond neutral and into restrictive territory.
We are in a situation where inflation is high, it's broad-based, it's persistent, and rates are still well below normal. And so I think the spirit is you want to get back to where you want to go as fast as you can without breaking anything.
The U.S. military is banning the use of anti-personnel landmines. The U.S. has a stockpile of about 3 million mines that it'll work to destroy, it says. An exception is being made for South Korea, which uses them in its defenses against the North. The White House says mines have a disproportionate impact on civilians, including children. Human Rights Watch calls the move good but not good enough. Australia's wine marketing and research body is closing its physical office in Shanghai. High tariffs have made business unviable in what was once the most prized market for Aussie winemakers. Back in 2020, worsening relations led to Beijing suddenly imposing import duties of more than 200% on Australian products. Exports to mainland China plummeted by 97% in 2021. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Bonnie Quinn. This is Bloomberg. Juliet.
Thank you, Bonnie. Well, Elon Musk says a recession is inevitable at some point, more likely in the near term.
And Bloomberg Editor-in-Chief John Micklethwaite spoke exclusively with Musk at the Qatar Economic Forum, and I also asked him for an update on his takeover plan for Twitter.
With respect to the Twitter transaction, there's a limit to what I can say publicly, given that it is somewhat of a sensitive matter. So I will have to be measured in my responses here, such as not to generate incremental lawsuits.
That seems to be a risk you sometimes manage to overcome.
Yes, deposition minimization is, I think, important.
Have Twitter given you enough information?
Well, there are still a few unresolved matters. You've probably read about the question as to whether the number of fake and spam users on the system is less than 5%, as Twitter claims, which I think is probably not most people's experience when using Twitter. So we're still awaiting resolution on that matter, and that is a very significant matter. So we're awaiting resolution on that. And then, of course, there is the question of will the debt portion of the round come together, and then will the shareholders vote in favor? So I think those are the three things that stand in the, that need to be resolved before the transaction can complete.
What about the general state of the economy? Does that weigh on you when you think about this? I mean, you just described it. You have a super bad feeling about the economy. Are you still in that position? I just said to you earlier, Joe Biden has just come out and said that a recession in America is not inevitable. How do you feel about the economy?
Well, I think a recession is inevitable at some point. As to whether there is a recession in the near term, I think that is more likely than not. It certainly isn't. It's not a certainty, but it appears more likely than not. What do you think?
I'm with you. I agree with you. I think it's more likely. Can I ask you one particular thing to do with the Twitter bid, which is, you are one of the biggest and fastest growing investors in China. Tesla, you've talked about it being a third of your sales going forward. You're now buying Twitter, the kind of public forum for free speech. The Chinese historically don't tend to be very enthusiastic about free speech. Are you worried about whether you can keep those two particular horses running? Is buying Twitter going to get you in trouble with the Chinese?
Well, Twitter does not operate in China. Yes. So, and I think China does not attempt to interfere with the free speech of the press in the U.S. As far as I know, because I assume you're not under pressure at Bloomberg from China. So I think there's. I don't think this is going to be an issue.
And in terms generally of that issue of freedom of speech and Twitter, you've talked about Twitter making it even freer and letting more people onto it. Is there a limit at all to who you think should be allowed onto Twitter?
Well, my aspiration for Twitter, or in general for the digital town square, would be that it is as inclusive, in the broader sense of the word, as possible. That it is an appealing system to use. So, I mean, ideally, I'd like to get like 80% of, let's say, North America, and perhaps, I don't know, half the world or something, ultimately on on Twitter in one form or another. And that means it must be something that is appealing to people. It obviously cannot be a place where they feel uncomfortable or harassed, or they'll simply not use it.
And that was Elon Musk speaking with Bloomberg's editor-in-chief John Micklethwaite at the Qatar Economic Forum in Doha. Well, coming up on Bloomberg Markets Asia, why India is set to resist any anti-US messaging out of this week's BRICS summit, and potential Chinese and Russian efforts to score a propaganda victory. A preview next. This is Bloomberg.
In a world full of uncertainty, there's one thing you can rely on. The world's #1 broker. Dedicated to innovation, superior trade execution, award-winning platforms and services, renowned for reliability, passion for excellence, driven to succeed. Trade with the best. Trade with the pros. FX Pro. Trade like a pro.
In breaking news, oil prices are surging.
The world can be a noisy place.
Stock prices are set to soar.
But what if under all the noise was opportunity? Would you hear it? Would you see it? And if you did, would you take action? Join more than 3 million users in over 100 countries and be empowered with Capital.com.